Thank you. So, Fitzcarraldo Editions are an independent publisher specialising in contemporary fiction and long-form essays. What I always say with Fitzcarraldo is think very literary fiction, that's their cup of tea. That's their absolute jam. Pyrini Press is an independent publisher specialising in literature and translation. They've been going for over a decade and are one of the sort of stalwarts of their UK translation scene. Cyrus Press brings the best of Chinese fiction to English-speaking readers, and a big shout out to Daniel for having had that idea for today. It was very much his instigation and his thought that got the ball rolling. V&Q Books publish commercial and literary fiction and narrative non-fiction from Germany. Much of the writing is translated from German, but as well they translate from other languages written within the country and have a book from Croatian coming out next year. Then our speakers today, we have Adriana Hunter, who translates from French. She has translated over 90 books in the last 22 years, and she is the now translator of Asterix. Annie Rutherford translates mainly from German. She is the programme coordinator at Stanza, Scotland's International Poetry Festival. They run Women in Translation Book Club at the Lighthouse Bookshop out of Leith in Edinburgh, and lots of queer women related literary projects that are all absolutely fantastic. Christopher Payne translates from Chinese. He is assistant professor at the University of Toronto and is associate chair for the English and Chinese translation programme. And then last but very much not least, another speaker from earlier in today, Sophie Hughes translates from Spanish. She specialises in literary fiction and she keeps winning all the awards in translation that there are out there to win. So thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. A little rundown. So I'm going to ask a question and then everyone's going to speak and we're going to sort of take it from there. So if Sophie could start, then Annie, then Adriana, then Chris, that would be fantastic. So the first question I'd like to go with is there anything that is untranslatable? Colloquially, we very often say that there are sounds or rhythms in a language that we feel are untranslatable, that we feel are unique to our language. And I thought that it would be useful in exploring the question of whether anything is untranslatable to focus on some challenges you may have faced in translation and some of the most difficult things you have found to translate. So yeah, Sophie, please take it away.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks to everyone. Also, Caitlin, I don't win all the I'm very lucky to be nominated for a few of them. I've had a good run.
My winner.
As to what's untranslatable, or if there is anything untranslatable, I mean, it's a question to be broken down, which is why we're here for an hour. If we're talking about whether or not there are books because of their content that are untranslatable, will never find a relevant audience in another context, then my answer is absolutely categorically no. If we're talking about words that often get pulled up, like saudade, from Portuguese, a language I don't speak, but my husband has lived in Brazil for many years, and we've spoken about this word a lot. It always comes up as one of the words that are supposedly untranslatable, and it describes an emotion, one that is linked to missing home, nostalgia. I don't think there is even a word that is related to an emotion that I would say is untranslatable, because I believe that that's why we translate, because as humans all around the world, there are things that link us, that bind us. It doesn't mean we're all going to agree and feel the same way about the same word when we read it, and that has to do with our biographies as readers as well. But translation is about the attempt of, it's like the reaching out to touch someone else, isn't it? Which is what writing is too. It's that attempt to try to touch, to try to make sense to someone else. There are conundrums that I have faced. I'm not going to go on for too long because I'm aware there's so many of us, and I suppose we can come back. There are conundrums that I face. So when it comes to sort of imparting an experience to a reader, I really don't think there's any text that's untranslatable, that there's always a way as a reader. But having said that, there are jokes that you have to rewrite. There are contexts, foods, names of places that mean something immediately, directly to a reader in the original language, the country of the original, or the countries of the original language, or the context of the original language, that mean nothing to many people reading it in another one. And in those cases, you do, as a translator, sort of tear your hair out, I think, or I do, and just say, I really don't know what to do here. But even when you meet what feels like an impasse, there's a solution. Sometimes the solution doesn't look like what we call traditionally translating, but creative solutions, or sometimes very boring solutions. Like sometimes especially if you're translating nonfiction, then you may just have to use a footnote or something, which is a sort of controversial choice. And I've never actually done it, but people do, and the translators I trust working with their own reasons, and will have their own justifications for making those. So basically, no, absolutely nothing is untranslatable.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Sophie that like my short answer is no. And I think often when people pick on those words, like the Portuguese word you meant, and there are even whole books of them, they say they're untranslatable because there isn't like one English word which means like hygge or whatever. But we describe that word in English, and that's what translation is. Like, translation isn't word for word necessarily. I mean, particularly not when you're translating from German and they have a whole word for one sentence. So I think it's bearing in mind that, of course, things are going to morph. But in that sense, I feel like, yeah, language is language, and it's just creating the same shape with different building blocks in a way. I do think, like Sophie says, sort of social coloring can be really tricky. But then, I mean, I'm so bad at pop culture. If I read an English book which is contemporary and has loads of pop culture references, I'm not going to get all of those. So claiming that I would have the same experience as like a friend of mine who's actually seen all or any of the Matrix films is not, you have to remember that even within a language, readers are individual and they're going to bring their own experiences. I have done the footnoting thing. I think my two trickiest things are kind of opposite extremes of translating academic work, which is my least favorite translation job. And I once translated an article about literarische Nachlass, which in German is 2 words, and literally means the papers that an author leaves behind when they die. So like unfinished drafts, or unfinished works, earlier drafts, letters, manuscripts, diaries, all of these things. And obviously that's translatable because I literally just said what it is. But also it's not quite as snappy. So I think I said either heritage or legacy, and I just had a footnote of like, this is exactly what I mean with this phrase, which was then tricky when I came to a later thing that was like a different meaning of legacy, but you work around it. And then the other challenges I faced have more been when I'm translating poetry and when you get like a pun that's doing really heavy duty of meanings on multiple levels. So I think recently I was translating a poem about, so it was responding to E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman with the automaton, the girl who's an automaton, and it mentions a Schlitzohr, which is like a slot, which is clearly in her ear, but a Schlitzohr is also like a sneaky devil, or it's a negative word for somebody. And I think I ended up going with like the crooked slot in her ear, which obviously is a lot longer in English, but you've got the negativity and you also have the physical meaning of it. The one book which I always say is untranslatable, which I would love to be able to translate, is Anagram Poetry. So Jan Wagner's got a wonderful collection called Die Eulenshäuser in den Hallenshäusern, and a third of it is all poems where every single line is an anagram of the first line. So if you were to translate that, you would basically have to do two translations for every poem, one for the form and one for the content, because that's just, yes, so completely different. But I feel like that's the most extreme thing of form and content really being interwoven. And otherwise, yeah, like when it's individual words, I get really annoyed when people talk about untranslatable words. It's one of my bugbears. So I'm very happy to talk about it for an hour. Yeah, I'll stop talking.
Adriana?
Sorry, it's me. I have to say, everyone keeps freezing. So if you lose me, I'll go away and come back again. I completely agree that there's nothing that's untranslatable, because I love a challenge anyway. But in a way, I would also say, well, duh, of course there's stuff that's untranslatable. Of course there is. And on the sort of nitty gritty of words, and especially puns and wordplay, of course you can't translate them because they're just different. The pun doesn't work. But the thing then is, you're not translating those individual words, and you're not doing kind of labored explanation of, oh, well, this was quite funny in the French because actually that word is the same as that word. And obviously no one's going to do that. But what you're doing is giving your readers the same ride. You're giving them the same experience. So if that particular pun doesn't work, you'll find one in the next door sentence, or you'll make a different pun within that same sentence. And I seem to have ended up being a bit of a specialist of word games in translation. And I can only think of one in my whole career where I've replicated the pun. And that was in Frédéric Beigbeder's book, 99 Francs, which was originally, the original title was 9.99. And then when it came out in paperback, it was 6.99. And he had des filles potables qui parlaient dans des téléphones portables, which basically means really tasty girls talking into mobile phones. But you had these two words, potable, portable. And I had nubile girls talking into mobile phones. And it doesn't even work in American because they don't say mobile. You know, the US market will say, well, this doesn't work. It's a cell phone, for God's sake. So, you know, they'd have to retranslate it for their readership. So that in all the puns that I've had the pleasure of translating, that's the only one I can think of that worked absolutely directly from one language to another. But it doesn't matter, because everywhere where there's a pun, I'll find a one to take its place. The only other thing I was going to say is there are some things that are a real pain in French, particularly. I'm sure this happens with other languages. The neutral third person singular, you know, one doesn't. In French, it's complicated by the fact that
she foretold the future.
to translate, it's so difficult to translate, and sometimes it's you and sometimes it's we. But then I've had books recently where I did a book, a beautiful memoir by a mother, and it was written to her child who'd had a terrible, terrible cancer. And the whole book was addressed to him, you. So obviously then I couldn't use the word you whenever I was doing an sentence. And similarly, I've worked on books, we did this, we did that, we did the other. So then when you come across, it can't possibly be we. And you tie yourself in knots trying to avoid this really inelegant construction of saying, which in English sounds far too formal, or using a passive construction, which is just clunky. So it's not untranslatable, but as Sophie was saying, you know, it has you pondering, it has you scratching your head a bit.
Thank you. And Chris?
Hi. Yeah. I'm not going to go against anyone else. I agree that if we're thinking of things that are untranslatable, then I would say categorically no, there isn't anything untranslatable, because I look at the task, as others have said, is that we're trying to find analogs in our target language, as opposed to trying to find these equivalencies. And that's I mean, using from my own teaching experience, I get a lot of my students who are native speakers of Chinese who then are struggling with trying to find the exact word into English for their homework assignments and tasks and stuff. And they fire off all of these emails and say, I can't figure out the exact word. I can't get the right word. And I'm like, well, you don't need to freak out about trying to find the right word. That's not what we're trying to do here in terms of translating these things. And the question that came up, about putting footnotes in, that's another. There are methods and approaches or strategies that people can employ to kind of convey the meaning of what it is that you're trying to get across. And I guess that's kind of what I take home from working with Chinese texts, is that I'm trying to give my readers a feel for this environment and this kind of literary heritage and this experience. But at the same time, I also have to be aware that if I make it completely alien because I'm trying to find all of these equivalencies, then I'm going to alienate my target readers and they're not going to enjoy the reading experience. So if they don't enjoy the reading experience, well, then I think of myself, then I failed in translating that work, because we're trying to convey this, different cultural perspectives, but at the same time, we're looking for these commonalities that people can engage with it and identify with it. And that's what, I look at my mom as an avid reader, and she reads all of these things. And I don't think Asymptote is here, but I did a shout out to them because I got her onto the book club. And she's been reading all of these things, all of these translated novels and stuff. And we had these discussions about it, and it's been really fruitful, because I think of her as, that's kind of the target reader, well informed, looks at and stays on top of things happening in the world and wants to know about what's happening in the world and stuff, but is, only speaks English, and is that type of, experience that she wants to have something that she can get into. And so that's how I approach it. So is there anything that's untranslatable? No, I don't think so, because it's this idea of looking for equivalencies is not really what translation, for me at least, is not really what it's about. The pronouns you mentioned, Adriana, is funny because in Chinese there's examples of zero pronouns. So there is no pronoun, and you actually have to try and decode who's saying what. And sometimes you have to track back through the text to find out who's saying what. And if you're working with, say, classical Chinese, then it's even more problematic, because grammar was an invention that was put onto classical Chinese retrospectively. So then but again, it goes to this question, well, I'm trying to get this across to my reader. That's my emphasis. I want them to experience something and engage in it. And if I have it really clunky and very inarticulate, or if it's literature and filled with footnotes, I think back, my mom's not going to look up footnotes. She's not interested in that. She wants to just read and enjoy, and in the evening. And that's kind of the perspective I try to put myself in when I'm trying to translate materials. So yeah, I think other than that, I don't have much else to add. I mean, we could talk about this, for the rest of the day, because I know I have students who continually email. My emails popped up a couple of times because they've got homework due soon, that they're asking these questions. So it's quite apropos that we're talking about it.
Can I just add something to that quite all of us have kind of given quite similar answers, and I wonder if we'd had an interpreter. I know it's International Translation Day, but I wonder if we'd had an interpreter, if we would have had any different answers, because I'll never forget, and I can't remember which talk I was at or when it was right at the start of when I began to translate, but someone told an anecdote about how there was a Japanese interpreter who was interpreting Jimmy Carter, who'd gone to give a talk somewhere, and at some point the audience just absolutely fell about laughing, and then afterwards Jimmy Carter said, well, that really went down well. I suppose I didn't expect that to get such a big laugh. How did the interpreter do it? How did you do it? The interpreter said, well, I said, President Carter has made a joke, please laugh. and I'll never forget it. I wish I could remember who told that anecdote, because it wasn't me in the first place. But yeah, I'll never forget it, because it always makes you so relieved to be a literary translator. Not just because you get so much time to come back and think about all of these riddles, but also now in the environment and the culture that is being created and that is developing, especially over the last 30 years, we're not just allowed to be creative in that way. We're positively encouraged to be, precisely for the reasons Christopher was giving about the enjoyment of the reader is so important. It's really the pinnacle of our endeavor. And
well, Adriana is an interpreter. Is that what you're about to say?
No, I wasn't going to say that, actually. I was going to pick up on what Sophie was saying about, and Chris was saying this as well, about reader enjoyment. And when I teach translation, I always say to my students, it's really important that the sentences sound as if they were born in English. It's not okay for them to be clunky and weird. And this is exactly what Christopher was saying about, if something's a bit inaccessible in the Chinese because of the style and the grammar that was imposed on a former system. But if the people reading it in the original would have understood it and it would have flowed for them, don't make it clunky and weird. In he's got that. And that's what our job is. So it's not untranslatable. It's just you're having to. Funnily enough, someone asked me only yesterday on the subject of another book. Someone was saying, "Did you take any liberties with the text?" I said, "Well, no, I didn't take any liberties, but I made departures from the text, and it's kind of different. I'm being faithful to the text by distancing myself from it." And I think that's something that non-translators take a little while to get their heads around.
There's a translator's note that someone posted on a Facebook group last week or something, Adriana, that said, the translator's note just said, "Liberties have been taken, full stop." And that was the end of the translation.
I was wondering if we could come at the conversation from a slightly different perspective. So Arunava Sinha talks about translation. He talks about every single physical e-copy, every single copy of a text as a different version of a text. And then if you take that, say there's 100,000 versions of a text, and then you have a translation is just 100,001. It's no sort of there is just a version as all texts are versions. And I think the thing to add into that conversation is that, when I read a text at every point in my life, if I was reading the same book, I'd take different things from that same book. And, I like sort of Annie's point about cultural points and references and meaning and layers of meaning. I think I've said before that sometimes somebody could put an in-joke in that's just for one friend, and nobody other than that one friend is going to get that in-joke that's in that book, and they don't get that layer of meaning that's there. So in this way, translation is just a filter like any other that we lay on texts, and there is actually no original text, because all texts are versions of a text, so there's no hierarchy that you can have in there. So I was wondering if we could go around again, and if sort of that's something that chimes with you, or if there's anything you want to add to that. Sophie, do you want to go? Let's do Sophie, Annie, Adriana. Also, I was wondering you could talk about sounds, because I think sounds are really important to obviously to a spoken language rather than a signed language or something like that. But sounds are something that feel hard to translate. Is that the case or not?
I'll maybe answer the sound one first, because you've just read Paradise, haven't you? So I've just translated a book by a Mexican author called Fernanda Melchor, and I've translated one of her other works before, and I'm just doing the third book now. But Paradise is spelt in the English translation Paradais. So Paradise, which is kind of as close to a sort of phonetic spelling as the text would allow, because the point about it throughout the Spanish book, so the Spanish title is the same apart from that the first A has an accent, which in Spanish means that you stress it. It doesn't change the sound of the A, you just put the emphasis on that A. So it's paradise. And the reason it's called that is because the character who didn't finish school, he's only 16 and he hasn't got very far in school, and he's the gardener from a very working class background, like extreme poverty, and he's a gardener in a really wealthy gated community, and the community is called Paradise, spelt the English way, but he's never seen it written down, so he thinks it's called spelt as it phonetically sounds as he would spell it in Spanish. So there was like a translation conundrum there of made much worse by the fact that the publishers, actually the sales team, not even the editors, but the sales team in the States said, not an accent, we can't have an accent in the title, because I just wanted to have exactly the same title, which made sense to me. But we reached a compromise because their suggestion was spelling it paradise, as we spell it. But I said, but you know how many people are going to come at me and say, you know, that's not a translation of paradise. Like, and I thought people who don't speak Spanish might think that, with a good reason. They could assume that. So we went round and round in circles, and just taking that accent off, that was the compromise. In a way, because it does change how a Spanish person would hear it now, but I suppose most English readers won't know that if they don't know Spanish. In the States it's a little bit more complicated because Spanish is such a highly spoken language there, but we'll see what people think about it. But that about sound is, I mean, and generally speaking, sound is key. I do read out my translations out loud, and I've heard lots of translators say that, but I recently heard a writer say, I can't remember who it was, I never read my books out loud because you don't read naturally how you read in your head. And it hadn't really occurred to me, and they said, I don't want it to sound like a performed piece. I want it to have a different kind of natural rhythm, which slightly threw a spanner in the works of my process. I'm gonna have to think about it.
Annie?
Yeah, I guess so. Resound for poetry, I definitely spend a lot of time walking around my class and not even reading out loud, but just like repeating short phrases to myself and getting really annoyed. And I don't find I find sound important, but I don't find it hard, which I guess is a little bit of a contradiction. I mainly translate living poets, which helps, and I've heard their voices, and sort of, rhythm and performance style can kind of come across quite clearly there, and that's something that I find is really helpful for translating. Actually, like I've got a lot more than just the page to go on. So particularly when there's poems that like take sort of the style of the Old Testament, of that kind of repetition and musicality, or things that are really fast paced or whatever, I find that really fun to do in English, but I couldn't tell you how I do it. Yeah, just a lot of talking out loud to myself, I guess. And read sort of interpretations and whether the translation is just another text. So I do think of translation as the closest possible form of reading that there is, and in many ways it's just its own reading. But I also remember once one of my lecturers talking about reading. She said that like every book is like a house, and there are all of these different possible routes through the house that you can choose what direction that you go in. And when you read a book, you can only take one route effectively. And so I think the tricky thing with translation is trying to keep as much of the house, and not just saying, okay, well, I'm going to go through the kitchen into the garden, but like maybe somebody else wants to go upstairs to the bedroom. And I think that what you're trying to do as a translator is keep as much of that multiplicity as possible. And what maybe can arguably be untranslatable is like having all of the multiplicity of an original text. So I think that's where translation differs from being just another reading, because it does have to have more options for more readers.
Could you say you make another house though? Maybe like the counter argument is you built a house that has multiplicity that actually wasn't in the source text house.
I mean, yeah, like occasionally I'll build a garage, but that would be like, and there are genuinely times where I'm like, got this great wordplay and we're putting it in. I do normally check with the poet, and they're normally fine with it. But I would still be trying to keep all of their different layers and their different rooms. And I know that there'll be the odd room that is walled up and, unfortunately you just can't go in there in English, but we try and make sure that doesn't happen.
What do you think, Adriana?
I'm going to talk about this idea of interpretation rather than the sounds question, because I'm very interested in that. I've recently translated a book which won the Prix Goncourt in France, The Anomaly, which is going to be published in the States in November. It's not coming out in this country till next year. And it's a very clever book. And there's a book within the book, which is also called The Anomaly. And in that anomaly, the author says, he says, no writer ever writes the reader's book, and no reader ever reads the writer's book. At best, they have the final full stop in common. And so what he's saying is that as we read, we cannot help but interpret. We cannot help projecting our own sensibilities onto a text. And we as translators are readers and we're writers. So, as Annie's just said, we can't help walking one particular way through the house. We've got to try to be aware of the other routes through the house. But actually, I would slightly argue against that, because I don't think we should do anything contrived. I think we respond to a book in a particular way, and that's what we deliver. That's what we're paid to deliver. And I think if it's try hard, if you try to read too much into something that doesn't come to you spontaneously, that will have a restricting effect on how you translate the book. And I think that freedom to respond to it and to let it flow, and I'm sure you all know this, when it's flowing, sometimes it's really like copy typing. It's wonderful. It's just, it's all happening and it's fizzing out of my fingers. And if I kept trying to interrupt that and think, maybe I haven't looked in the loft to use Annie's beautiful example of a house, I think that would cramp that fluency.
What do you think, Christopher?
Yeah, no, it's interesting listening to this discussion and the versions of versions of versions, and think of them as a palimpsest, right? Where you have all of these things written on top of each other, and then each individual reader is going to tease something new out of it, right? And that's kind of the process of reading. I'm reminded just of this is almost considered to be a bad thing to do, but I've been getting my students to read translations by Ezra Pound of classical Chinese poetry. And they've been reading it, and they've been comparing them to a Chinese translator, Xu Yuanchong, who translated the same poems, particularly because he felt that Pound had ruined them and had destroyed the musicality of them, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting because I've read Xu Yuanchong's translations, and classical Chinese poetry is supposed to rhyme. So there's lots of rhyming in it. And Xu invents these rhymes in his English translations. And my students really enjoy his translations. And I read them and I don't really enjoy them at all. Give me Ezra Pound any day over these fabricated, invented rhymes, because it doesn't read well to me. And that's that different readers will come with different expectations for reading a text, that we all have these horizons of what we perceive that we will get out of a text, and it's going to be different. So that idea of versions upon versions, I'm not saying that Xu's are bad translations, it's just it appeals to a different sort of reader. So there is a multiplicity of sounds in all of these translations, I think. And that's, the analogy of the house. Some rooms are going to be closed up. We don't want to go down to the basement because it's just not going to work in a certain language, or it's not going to have that auditory quality to it, I suppose. I find it really fascinating, and listening to my students kind of dialogue about this, of which versions, and we looked at other ones as well from academics translating the same text. There's this fantastic text I do with them. It's one poem by Wang Wei, who is this Tang Dynasty poet, and there's 19 versions of his poem. And I get the students to read it, and they're just like, this is baffles the mind. It's one poem. How can there be 19 versions of it? But there are, and all of them are equally enjoyable on different levels. And I find that this version upon versions, it's like a palimpsest. That's what comes to mind for me.
Does anyone want to jump in there and add anything to that? No? In which case, I shall sort of augment that question. Is there anything in the languages that you work from that you think is most often mistranslated, or that you find particularly, be it sound, be it rhythm, be it these things, everything we've talked about? Is there anything in your languages that you love, or is there anything indeed in English that you think that you really love and that is hard to replicate, if not untranslatable? Let's do Sophie again.
2 rounds again. I love translating slang and dialogue because it used to cripple me with fear. I think I've always loved translating dialogue. I've always really enjoyed that, and recently a friend of mine who made a film asked me to do the subtitles for it. I'm not a subtitler, but I said as a favor I'd do them, and I really enjoyed it, and I was like, God, this is great. And then I realized it was because it was all dialogue. So I really enjoy that, but I used to be really, really like sort of crippled with anxiety about like dislocating the context of a book, of a story. No, so for example, Veracruz slang, well, where's it going to go? I can't have a hodgepodge of someone speaking in English. So do I have to choose which English to use? But it's a little bit linking in as well to what Adriana was saying. If you start going down that road and worrying too much and thinking too theoretically about it, then then nothing natural or good can come out. And I really believe that. So I suppose probably all my dialogue ends up having kind of like a slight lilt or slight twang or slight sort of vocab from where I'm from. But that's another good reason for why translators always say, read as widely as you can, live as widely as you can, keep your ears out, keep a notepad, because your English is always developing if you remember to let it. So yeah, I think the thing that I find most potentially tricky or thorny, which is translating dialogue, is also one of the things I get the most pleasure out of, and I've learned to just kind of not think about too much, just go with.
My thoughts are all over the place, so I think I'm trying to order them. I actually really enjoy what you mentioned there, Sophie. Despite my accent, I live in Scotland and I grew up here. And I really love being able to work in Scots words. So stramash, which is, I don't know how to describe a stramash, but it's a great word. I'm sure you can agree. It's like a muddle or a guddle, but it's a little bit more dramatic. And yeah, words like that are like, it's not sort of exactly Scots dialect, it's just words that you use. And I love being able to work in like slightly more non-standard English words. I always find that really fun and really important because, most people in the UK do not speak RP English the entire time. And I think it's really important to represent those parts of our lives. I think German translation difficulties are probably the same as a lot of European languages, that there's a formal U and an informal U, and like there's a much more kind of differentiated register, I feel, of whether you're speaking formally or not, which I find more difficult in a living situation than a translation situation. I find it very stressful as an intern of knowing how to address people. But I think that's something that is, I wouldn't say it's always wrongly translated, but you can always tell that translators have put a lot of thought into it when there's a significant shift of somebody moving between the different forms of you. I think the thing that I really love is I genuinely think German's such a beautiful language, and I feel it's a much maligned language that people think that French is beautiful, but like German's just old Nazi films. And so I guess I kind of want to try and get that in my translations, that it's an amazing, like really vibrant language, and there's so much going on in it, and I want to try and echo that a little bit.
One of the things I really enjoy is I only translate one language. I translate French, and English has a much bigger vocabulary than French, and I really like the concision of I take pride in my version always being shorter than the original. You know, it's going to be 10% shorter than the original, and if it's not, I'm being lazy. I'm not doing my job properly. If you have to sort of waffle to explain something, no, stop and calm down, and just let those lovely, concise, precise English sentences come to you. And then on the other side of the coin, one thing I love about translating from French is that French tolerates many, many more subclauses than English does. And the book I was talking about earlier, Winter Flowers, there's one particular little paragraph there. It's a 4 or 5 line paragraph, and it's all one sentence. And it's just so complicated. It's about somebody going to bed with a plate that then spills some crumbs, and the child that she's getting into bed with is a little bit grumpy with her, and she's still annoyed about something that happened earlier, and eventually softens, and then they laugh about the crumbs in the bed or something. But it's just all done in subclauses, and you just can't do it. It's that, and it's the sequence of, wait a minute, am I going to say that the child's annoyed first, or am I going to say that she's got the plate in her hand? Oh, but wait, hang on, because I've got to mention the crumbs. But it's like a crossword puzzle of trying to work out which order I'm going to do it in. Am I going to be able to do it in one sentence? No. In that particular incident, I broke it down into 2 sentences. And I really, really enjoy those, where you think, in order to say all the stuff that he or she has said, I've got to do something different here.
I guess it comes back to me. Adriana just made me relive learning French here in Canada, and looking at passages, and it's like, where's the full stop? Where does this end? It just keeps going and going. And I remember being frustrated along, with my classmates at that. But yeah, I actually, like Sophie, I love working with dialogue. I really enjoy the banter that you can create in that you see in Chinese texts and that you can create in English. And I'm from Newfoundland myself, so I have this different linguistic heritage that I come with. And if I were to speak as a Newfoundlander would, people would just gloss over and not really understand anything that I'm saying. And I try to actually bring that into some of my translations. So I was, the recent one with The Mountain Whisperer by Jia Pinghua is very rural, and it's very much land-based. And so I found this, how am I bringing in my own experience, which is very much rural, but also maritime-based, and how do these things jive together to create this colloquial feel to the story? Because these people, they're shepherds up on the mountain and stuff. The education is kind of foreign to them, but there's such a liveliness to their language, and there's such a vibrancy to it that, I lived in England too, and nobody speaks RP, actually. I don't think it exists. And so living in Manchester, I got exposed to Mancunian. And that gave another aspect of a musicality to the language. And so I strive for that in dialogue, to kind of, because people don't speak academically, and that's what I love about translating dialogue and sections of dialogue, is that you can bring that life to it as this idea of life lived.
Absolutely. If anyone wants to ask any questions of anyone on our panel, pop them in the chat, or everyone, pop them in the chat now. So the first one I'm going to start with is Noor's question. And this is for everyone, so feel free to jump in whenever you like. If nobody jumps in, we'll start with Sophie and do the circle. Just so Sophie's won.
Let's go the other way. Let's go the other way.
We'll go the other way. Oh, Chris, you'll have to start this time. So the question is, how do you balance theory and what instinctively feels right to you when translating? So the way I've interpreted that question is thinking about, do you sit there and translate with sort of guidelines that you've worked out or your theory that you sort of subscribe to, or do you just do that in other time, and then when it comes to translating, instinctively follow what's right?
I guess Sophie's put me on the spot to
I think so.
Instinctively, I would think I try to keep theory out of it. I teach it, and I don't want to use it in practice. I was listening to John Minford speak a little while ago, and he's a translator of many different Chinese texts, and he remarked, that those who do the theory are the ones who aren't actually translating, because that's what they do, is just theory. So this idea of trying to balance these two things out, I think there is a place for theory, and certainly I teach it, but for actually translating, I would go instinctively about what kind of feels right. And I do read out my translations, because I do like to hear how they sound. I know that that's not how people read. We're not grade school and reading out loud, but I still appreciate that oral aspect of it. And so that's theory to one side, and maybe later on, if I analyze something, I'll use it. But for translating itself, it's go with what feels right or what sounds right to me.
I really agree with Christopher there, and would say that theory as such per se doesn't really enter into what I do as a translator at my desk. Having said that, there are a series of questions that one or we or you have to ask yourself as a translator, which is sort of exemplified in that. You do exactly what Adriana, we've all been saying it in different ways today, is that there are decisions to be made. And I was said it earlier in our discussion that I do think that the mark of a mature translator, the kind of translator that I would hope to be, and if I'm not there yet, then I aspire to be it. But it is someone who over the length of a book can make those kind of made those decisions consistently in such a way that they no longer appear there at all, that they wouldn't be obvious to the reader, but that even someone picking apart the translation could say, no, actually, I do think that their choice of leaving things in the original, it has been done with care and thoughtfully and for a reason. Because you can quickly enter into theory, for example, with leaving Spanish in and italicizing it. Do we italicize it? Do we not? And often some of the theory is actually just discussions between you and your editor about things like that. And they're not really au fait with theory, most of them. And my brain starts thinking about the theory. But usually it just boils down to me saying, but I don't want to pull the reader out of the experience of the story. So can we translate it and not leave it in Spanish, even though I know that lots of Americans will be able to understand the Spanish, but I don't want these people to be thinking these are Spanish readers these are Spanish speakers in this moment. They're just speakers existing within a community, for example. They're not thinking about being Spanish speakers, so we shouldn't be thinking about them being Spanish speakers, if that makes sense. I hope I have made sense. It's getting late.
I think the closest I come to theory really is other translators writing about their work, which it isn't, very much isn't academic or anything. And so I wouldn't necessarily say it influences me when I'm translating, but I find it such a relief then when I'm kind of questioning myself and second guessing myself, just to be like, oh no, it's fine. This other person had this problem too, and they freaked out about it too. And I respect them. So it's okay if I freak out about it. I find something like theory quite reassuring sometimes, just to be like, okay, no, it's okay to worry about this, or it's okay to have to make a decision. But I think it's much more something that I find has to be tied into, like Chris said, the people who are actually doing the translation and not necessarily the people who are talking about it in a university context.
I'm going to make a confession. I have no idea what translation theory is. You know, I've been doing this for 22, 23 years. I've translated nearly 90 books. I don't want to know what translation theory is. I just feel it in my guts. It's really visceral, and it's an intellectual process, and it's a very emotional process. I don't need theory crowding in there to add to the mix. Actually, Sophie has just given me a little idea of what translation theory is, and I think of that, the sort of things you were just discussing now, I think are more questions of house style. But I never sit back and look at a manual and if I come across something that won't work, I will go off and do something else, something really mundane, like, I don't know, hanging washing out or dog walking or something. And the extraordinary thing is the brain has a way of continuing to work even when you're not asking something of it. And these eureka moments just happen. And if there were theories to get in the way of that process, they would get in the way, I think. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of very important people who make a living being translation theorists, but I don't know what it is they do.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's absolutely fabulous. So Alexandra has a really interesting question, sort of relating to the different forms of you, which is how do you convey it when two characters' relationships change throughout a book? So maybe they develop from a formal relationship to friendship, and so therefore the language changes. Maybe it's more dialect. Is it bantering or joshing in dialogue? Is it first names? And I think this is a really interesting example of a question that is a question you could equally ask a writer, and in this way is looking at sort of that blurring of a translator writes every single word in a book that is in translation. So I was wondering if any of you had any examples of how you've done that, or anything interesting to add to that sort of question. And this time anyone is welcome to jump in, and I'll pick on Christopher though if nobody jumps in.
I can say what the best example that I've seen of that. Like I don't actually think I've ever had to deal with it, thank goodness. Luckily, not much dialogue in poetry. Really, really positive thing. But it's actually, I'm sorry because she's here, but Katie Darvish's translation in Bricks and Mortar by Clemens Meyer. There's a wonderful scene where there's kind of very much power play going on of how, like, there's an older guy who's quite influential and a young reporter, I think. And there, in the German, there's kind of this whole thing of like, which, the young guy saying sie, and the older guy being like, no, you can say do, but then kind of taking it back. And sort of, because it is generally like the older person who gets to decide what you use. And so it's not just that the relationship develops, but that it's really kind of a bit of a back and forth. And I think Katie there used first names, but very much say like the older man saying, oh, no, we can be on first name terms, and then kind of using different names for the guy and calling him young man or calling him by his name. And it was so clever. I really love that scene. So for me, that was like the best example that I've ever seen of that being done. Sorry, Katie, to put you on the kind of metaphorical spot there.
If anyone's got any other examples, or I've got a question just for Christopher. Now's the moment. So just for Christopher, Binha has a question. I read the novel Decoded, translated by you and Olivia. Did you find anything difficult to translate in the book? And how about just generally all the books you've translated from Chinese? Are there any difficult problems that have come up in particular?
Sure. I mean, there are always challenges with any text that you kind of set out to translate. There's going to be passages where it maybe takes a couple of read-throughs to get a feel for what it's trying to convey. Certainly with Decoded, when he goes into cryptography, for instance, we had to read up on cryptography because it's not exactly a topic that I'm necessarily familiar with. So to try and get the feel for that in English, we did read up on cryptography. We were sharing like resources and, reading things and playing around with writing ciphers and these types of things just to kind of get into that headspace. So I mean, and that I think that's true with any text that you kind of, you know, there are going to be sections or passages that prove to be a challenge at the beginning, but it's about reading about it. And I mean, I just did The Mountain Whisperer, and there are historical references to things. So going up and rechecking some of these historical references to try and get myself into that headspace once more of reading these things. So that's how we generally tackle the challenges. And I think that someone else said, right, taking a step back and hanging up the laundry or what have you is a good practice to. The brain keeps working, and then I found, you know, I'm doing something else, and then I'm like, oh yeah, wait a minute, that can work. And I rush back to my computer and I, you know, load up my file to write that down. Just because, okay, it came to me, and I've, you know, done that at all hours type of thing. So I guess that's one way of tackling those challenges, of taking a break sometimes, as well, and then doing other readings. So being very well read, right? That was said earlier. I think that's essential. You have to read other translated texts, read in your target language, just keep reading type of thing. So, and that really helps. And I have eclectic taste in reading, from sci-fi to historical novels and to poetry and so on. And I think reading different genres is also really helpful.
There's Binha also asked, how about Ji Pinghua's peculiar narrative style in The Mountain Whisperer? Would you try to convey it? In brief.
In brief, yeah, no, I did try to convey it on some level, but again, his style is very particular to himself and to his area of China, and that's one of his calling cards. And I said this earlier, if I tried to mimic that so much, I think I would do a disservice to my readers in English, who would find it very inaccessible. So I have to try and balance that out. And you know, again, think of what my reader is going to be able to engage with.
So we are on to the two last questions, and I think they're both really interesting ones. So this is one from Sharon, which is, how do you deal with English expressions in a foreign text that draw attention to the fact that they are English? So in your text, there's something that's English, and you have to translate it and also convey that, I guess, that foreignness that it would have, or that Englishness that it would have in another one. So Sophie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've got a sort of almost, it's similar to this. It's maybe they weren't drawing attention to the fact that they're English, but there's I recently started translating a novel in which it's in Spanish, and there is a Spanish speaking student, Bolivian student, with an American teacher who teaches him English, and she speaks English sometimes and Spanish sometimes, and there's a kind of wordplay between there. How I deal with it, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet. You can always do something like she said in English, which is just going to be the least intrusive way, I think, of dealing with it. Because just think italics might just look a bit like, it's not a convention, is it, to use italics there? So so it would look strange. So I think we may just have to occasionally put a few of those in, and then sometimes just not bother mentioning that she's saying it in English, only mentioning it if I sense as a reader that it's something that's coming from deeper inside her, and therefore she's saying it in English or something like that, you know, or it's more emotional, or she doesn't want him to understand it perfectly or something, or if it's a phrase that he might not fully understand, then of course I'll try and signal it. But yeah, probably by doing something extremely boring like saying she said in English.
I had a incident in one book. I know exactly what you mean about this business of something that's said in English. How do you convey the Englishness of it? And I think I've misremembered the example, but let's say, because this phrase came up in another book I was translating, that someone was talking about a girl lying back and thinking of England, the expression, you know, to lie back and think of England. And it was said in English in the text. And the character was quite kind of proud of themselves that they understood English culture enough to know the expression and to be able to, you know, sort of wield it in English. So I said pretty much what Sophie's just suggested. He said, showing off his English. So I I'd added some words. So if you want to be absolutely accurate, oh God, she hasn't translated what it said in the original. But the French readers would have understood that he was showing off. They might even have had to go and look it up. They wouldn't have known what it meant. But I wanted to convey that. So I just tucked in a few extra words to say he was showing off.
Annie?
I've occasionally added some German. Normally not the equivalent, but particularly where I feel like multilingualism is to do with the author's style, then sometimes I've, at a different point in the text, then worked in their language where it makes sense, which again is kind of particularly for poetry. I'm not sure that would really work in a novel setting, but it means that I'll have poems Nora Gomringer has a poem about F.D. Roosevelt, and that's got English in, and it's just completely in English because that makes sense. And then one of her poems, which is a clearly German setting, I've kept the odd line in German.
I like that comparison. So our very last question comes from Helen Wang, who some people, hi Helen, lovely to see you here. So Helen asks, do you think some books work better in particular languages? And I guess that for me that question is just, do you have books that you prefer in one language, or are there maybe nothing sort of judgment wise on them? There's just something to the way that somebody wrote it in the one language, or that it was translated, that you just prefer the one and think that it's somehow more suited to that language. And let's go Adriana, Sophie, Annie, Chris.
I'm going to be honest, the internet cut out, so I didn't hear the question. Maybe if someone else starts, then I'll hear the answer and I'll get a hang of what the question was. I think I read it earlier. Is it about languages being more appropriate for it? Can someone else answer and I'll catch up? So I froze, or you all froze.
Sophie, you're on the spot.
If I can, I'll read the book in the original. But that's because the languages that I can read, I translate from. So I'm interested in that kind of reading. I think I probably at some point will sort of throw in the towel and just go back to enjoying just reading in Spanish instead of always with another brain on. But yeah, books that I've been amazed by. I mean, I don't have an answer. Sorry, I don't have an answer, because all of the books that I've read, because the books I read in translation tend to be from languages I don't speak. But I mean, I can, yeah.
Well, it's something terrible.
I'll write it in if it comes to me.
Something I've noticed that's very odd in colloquial language is that people will say that's a good or a bad translation when they have only read the translation. I always think that's like a slightly odd thing that people sometimes say. So anyway, Annie, what do you think?
I do have an example in Chinese. I've read both the original, The Three Body Problem by Liu Cixin. It's very popular, but I enjoyed Ken Liu's translation much more than the original. I found it much more accessible and a much more enjoyable read. Not to say that I didn't like the original. I mean, I thought the original was really groundbreaking and different and stuff for a sci-fi novel. But I thought Ken Liu did a masterful job of translating it, and I enjoyed that one more. So that's maybe I'm gonna be tar and feathered now for for giving an example, but that's one example for me.
I agree with what Sophie just said, that I read books in translation when I don't have access to the original language. And if I could read the original language, I probably wouldn't bother reading the translation. But there was another point we were talking about. No, sorry, I've completely lost it. I've lost you now. Well, you've lost me. I've completely lost my thread. Sorry.
Why do you think that is, Adriana? Like, given that we're sort of talking about how like the translation is equal and all these sorts of things, like why do you think, is it just an academic drive? Is it because there's like, I feel like there's lots of different use cases. If I was studying someone and like writing a paper on them, fair, I'll try and read an original language. I don't speak any languages, so I'm not doing that. But what do you think's behind that?
Well, I would always want to read the original if I could. Well, with me, because I only speak one language, I only have one language to the sort of level where I could read literature. And I suppose it's partly because there aren't the hours in the day to be reading other people's translations. And also, and this is slightly, I don't know, it's sort of commercial of me. In a way, I'm almost not interested in a French book if I know somebody else has got that gig. It's like, oh, okay, that one's been put to bed already. It's not for me. I'll have to go and find another one. So I might just move on. And in fact, I spend a lot of my reading time is spent reading everything else that's out there in the English language, because I want to know where the books that I love in French, where they sit within the market. And when you write readers' reports, publishers want to know, where does it belong? Is this the new French Ian McEwan, or they want to know how something fits within the market. So I spend a lot of time reading stuff in English, and there aren't the hours in the day to be reading other people's translations of French books, I suppose. The other point I've just remembered I was going to make was when people talk about a good translation, I imagine what they mean, because they've no idea what the original was like and they've no idea how faithful it is. I imagine what they mean is that it reads fluently, is that it's back to this point I was making earlier, it reads as if it was born in English. And in a way, no one should ever need to say that, because all translations should be like that. So yeah, that's my sort of theory about people saying it's a good translation.
I like that answer a lot.
I kind of understood that question slightly differently, I have to confess. So Helen's question, and it made me think of when I finished uni, I did an internship at Cathy Babel, which some folk might know. It's an online European magazine. And we published languages in English, French, German, Italian, Polish, and Spanish. And you really noticed that some languages were much easier to translate between. And my editor, Nabila, said, I quite often just cut the final paragraph off Italian articles, because Italian and Spanish articles in particular would have these really flowery conclusions, which just in English just sounded unbelievably twee. And so I don't think that it's that certain books work better in particular languages, but I think particular maybe language families, you can have a much closer translation where, I mean, you do really notice it in poetry of like, oh, don't talk about the heart and the soul in English poetry. That's not really done. Whereas in Arabic or in Italian, that's very, very normal and natural. And I did notice that with Ajit Milkoran's book. I cannot remember the title. A really lovely road trip across the Arab Spring for women, like wonderful romp of a novel. Every chapter something new and totally ridiculous happens, but the dialogue in particular is really flowery, and the author herself has said like it's still too close to the Turkish, and actually the English could be a lot more stripped down and would read a lot more naturally. So I think that can be an interesting thing, but I don't think that means that book shouldn't work in English. I just think that I want to go through and edit it, basically.
I had a very, sorry, possibly Sophie was going to say something and I've interrupted again. I had a very interesting experience a few months ago when I went to a little conference with 8 other translators, and we were all working on the same book, this book, The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier. And so there was a German, a Dane, an Italian, a Spaniard, a Croatian, a Serb, and myself. There's one missing, but anyway, so there were 9, Portuguese. There were 9 of us, and we were discussing all the sort of so-called untranslatable bits in this book, and there were plenty of them because it's quite a sophisticated sort of narrative structure, and there's a lot of word games and that sort of thing. And it was absolutely fascinating how some bits, because the sort of headspace of French and English in some ways is quite similar. Some bits I'd say, yeah, no, this is fine, I've got this, it works in English. And, you know, the Portuguese girl would be saying, oh no, it was an absolute nightmare for me. And then there was one bit where there was an anagram of somebody's name, which she was so self-important, this character, that she thought it meant, you know, her name had been used as an anagram as a book title. And the Italian translator said, oh, you know, this works in Italian, it works the same. And in English, it didn't work at all. I had to completely rewrite that. I couldn't make the anagram out of the title, and I had to do something completely different. And we all came up with different solutions for how to deal with these problems. But it was interesting. So obviously between French and Italian and Spanish, slightly less so, and Portuguese less so, there were connections. But then every now and again, you know, the Dane would say, oh no, this works really well in Danish. And we'd all be amazed that there's no kind of logic as to why some things work and some things don't.
Well, I can't thank you all enough, but sadly we have to come to the end. We don't want, everyone needs their tea. So thank you very, very much. I really can't thank you. I love this talk. So the round of applause from the audience. And thank you also to Danny, Maddie and Katie and Claire, who's not with us today, for helping me organise today. It was really a group effort and we have had a lot of fun putting it on. I hope that you have all enjoyed it. If there are any events that you missed or you'd like to watch again, there will be links coming out hopefully in the next day or two, of sort of links to all the talks. They've all been recorded, so you can come back and see them. And yeah, we just want to wish you all a very happy International Translation Day, and hope that we've given you some things to think about and maybe some books to go buy. So thank you all very much for joining us.
I think I can say on behalf of all the guests and all the publishers, Caitlin, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, you'll make me blush.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you as well. That was a really wonderful panel. Thanks to all the participants.
Thanks for having us. It was great fun.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you to everyone who's come and watched and listened to all these events today. It's been wonderful to have you all here.
It really has. Should we have some music to play us out to? Well, thank you.
Dès que je la sors de son sommeil, cette boîte à musique